Welcome to the batch file submission training. In this training, we will explain the functionality and nuances of the submission process. We'll look at file processing methods, submission workflow, rejected records, and passed records. The objective of today's training is to help you identify the required steps for the batch file submission, demonstrate competency by uploading files, give you the ability to resolve submission errors with the ease and with the help of available resource documents. Lastly, we expect you to be able to perform the complete submission process through batch file upload. All of this will be in your ability by the end of today's training. So the agenda for today, the general outline of this training, as well as the different modules, we'll have an overview, we'll discuss some background, then we'll go into detail about the submission process and functionality. We'll discuss resolving rejected records, give you a methodology for success. We'll talk about reviewing past records, checking for accuracy among those records. And then we'll conclude everything with a wrap-up. So let's start with the overview and discuss the background of the file submission process. So one of the key concepts is that there are only 3 methods of submitting data to CALPADS. Whether you do online maintenance, a batch file submission, or submit data through API transfer, all the validations are consistent and the same. Online maintenance is only achievable at one student at a time. You can only edit data for an individual student record at a time. This is time-consuming and a manual process. However, because the validations are instant, it is efficient when you have very small corrections or you're trying to understand CALPADS. Batch file submissions is much more faster. It allows you to do multiple students. You can submit data en masse. Student information systems largely use the batch file submission process. Then API data transfer is an interface between CALPADS and another system. Special education systems communicate exclusively with CALPADS through the API transfer. Compressed files are posted automatically if the record's passed and rejected. Through API transfer, a report of your rejected records is available to you through your said system. Regardless of the submission method, again, the validations are consistent throughout and records are processed the same way. So let's walk through the data submission cycle. At the very least, you have a student information system, and then there's the CALPADS ODS, or operational data store, or the CALPADS database, however you like to think of it, right? You're going to extract files from your student information system and submit those files to CALPADS. Those files are first ran through a staging database and processed through an initial set of validations, looking for file type, formatting, just basic validations to make sure that those files are structured the same or consistently. If those records pass, they can be posted to the CALPADS ODS. Once you go through all your validations, checking for accuracy, consistency, those records can be posted to the CALPADS ODS. Any rejected records will result in errors and warnings. It's important to understand that those errors and warnings are reflective of that specific submission. You can review those errors and the records that generated the warnings. However, to correct these, you would have to submit a new file. Any online maintenance at this point to resolve any errors or warnings is directly to the CALPADS ODS. You're not affecting that batch file submission. Again, when you're resolving errors and warnings, you would submit corrected records from your student information system back into CALPADS. It would go from batch file to staging. That second submission with the corrected records should pass, and then you could post those records to the CALPADS ODS. Once it's in the CALPADS ODS, those records can be used for state testing, state data matches like foster youth or direct certification, and accountability. Your data can be pulled for cohort reports, or any number of long-term English learners, any measure of accountability from the data can be pulled. If it's student data, and we're talking about Fall 1, or teacher and course data for Fall 2. Applicable student records that have been posted to the CALPADS ODS are applied to snapshots. When submitting batch files, CALPADS accepts Excel spreadsheets or text files. These text files can be .txt, .csv. Also, an important concept is to understand that not all record types or file types are processed the same in CALPADS. There are 3 different methods. There's transaction processing, effective date processing, and replacement processing. Transaction processing is probably the most restrictive processing method. Often, records that exist in the ODS must be deleted, and then a new record is submitted in its place to update that record. Effective date processing is much more flexible. In fact, it's the greatest or offers the most flexibility. Simply update a record by submitting a new record with a different date. If it's a prior date to an existing record, it's added on. If it's an earlier record, it may overwrite the existing record. Effective date processing, again, is the most flexible and easiest to use. Replacement processing is the simplest, although you have to understand that all records with the corresponding operational key will be overwritten. Once you know the operational keys, it's easy to submit and complete these transactions. Understand that data not included in your file, data that's in the ODS with the same operational key, will be overwritten with replacement processing. So let's look at some of the file types and their transaction methods. Transaction processing applies to student enrollment, that's your SENR, student program, that's your SPRG, and special education, that's your SPED files. Again, one of the things that distinguishes transaction processing is typically to update a record. You would have to delete that record from the CALPADS ODS and then submit a new one in its place. Replacement processing in the middle, you see, are several file types. And these are generally file types that don't require ongoing maintenance. You would submit these file types within a submission window. When you talk about student incident, you have the sync, the source, the soft, or whether it's a course section file that you would submit in Fall 1 or Fall 2, or the student absence summary, which again is a summary of the attendance for the entire year, which should only be submitted during the end of year 3 submission window. Replacement processing, again, will overwrite any record in the CALPADS ODS that has the same operational key. A good resource to identify operational keys by file types is the CALPADS file specifications document. This is not the Forms Excel spreadsheet. This is a Word doc with the same name, CALPADS file specifications. You can find this document at the CALPADS system documentation page. The last one, of course, is effective date. And unfortunately, only student information and staff demographic records are effective date processing. Again, because so much data related to student and staff demographics can be changed frequently, it has the most flexibility. We're talking about name changes, potential gender changes, address changes, so on and so forth. Another key concept that relates to the submission process and batch files is ownership. The SENR file establishes ownership for all your student records. Either you're going to request SSIDs for new students or obtain ownership of SSIDs for transferring students. The ownership period is determined by your student enrollment start and end dates. Student enrollment records must be posted in the CALPADS ODS prior to the submission of any other student record type. Each file type has its own rules of how ownership applies, but it's always a comparison of the dates in that file, the school of attendance or the reporting LEA, and the student's enrollment period. The student information and the special education file types have ownership at the LEA level. As long as the student has an enrollment record within the LEA, you can submit student information and special education file types. However, student program records are at the school level. Program records must be within the enrollment period and match the same school of attendance for that enrollment period. It's important to understand the nuances of ownership as it corresponds to the different file types. Similar to ownership, there are record relationships. Record relationships determine the submission order, are subject to cross-file validations, are identified as either IVR or CVR errors. Also, it's important to understand that deleted data with disregard to potential relationships may lead to orphan records. For example, an SSRV record or a special education services record must have a SPED, a special education program record, posted prior to submitting the student service. For a student offense record to be posted, a student incident record with the same incident ID and enrollment record at the school of attendance must exist for the student at the time period that the incident occurred. So in addition to ownership and the enrollment period and potentially the school of attendance dictating records being rejected or passed, record relationships amongst file types is important to understand as well. So in preparation for any CALPADS submission, you must do a few things. You want to manage the security roles of the users. Make sure that only authorized users can submit file. You want to be careful who you give edit roles to. The edit role for any record type allows that user account to submit file types. You also want to make sure that you have attended training, reviewed reference documentation, and correctly have populated data in your CIS and SEDS. Resolving rejected records is the most time-consuming and troublesome part of the submission process. Submitting all the required data accurately is largely dependent on your data population in your student information system and your special education data systems. When we go into the demonstration, we will demonstrate the submission process, and that can be generalized in 6 steps. First, you want to prepare your data. You want to populate your student information system or your special education data system. Then you want to upload these files. Whether it's via API or through a batch file submission, you want the data to be extracted from your system locally and submitted to CALPADS. Once submitted to CALPADS, you want to view the submission status. Now, reviewing records and the submission status is exclusive to the batch file submission process at this point. When you look at API, it's going to automatically post past records. And although you can view rejected records, that's all you can do. The status won't change. No further processing is required. The batch file submission process, step 3, is the beginning of the submission process. You're going to view the submission status. Once you are reviewing a particular submission, you want to examine both the past records and the rejected records. That's step 4. Step 5 is looking at the rejected records in your local CIS. After you have posted the past records, you move on to step 5 and correct rejected records in your local CIS. Step 6, to complete the correction, you have to upload a new file to submit corrected data for those previously rejected records. Understand, any rejected record in a file type will never change. It's only reflective of that submission. Whether you correct data in CALPADS or your student information system and submit a new file to update CALPADS, the rejected records in a specific submission are only reflective of that submission at that specific time. Now, not covered in this training is the batch file submission for the student enrollment. It's very similar, but there are 2 extra steps. After you post your past records in an SENR submission, if you have any SSID candidates, you have to review and match those candidates. Once you've matched those candidates or requested SSIDs, you have to extract the new SSIDs so you could give the students in your student information system the SSIDs. This is typical of students who have transferred from out of state and never been enrolled in a California public school, or younger students, potentially preschool, TK, or KN, who have never attended a California public school. Likewise, if a student's whole academic career was at private school, it's possible that they don't have an SSID and you would have to request one and match them. So there's a separate training for that process. It's a little bit more involved, as you can see. And I would recommend that you go to the CALPADS user manual, and there's searching for students, requesting SSIDs, and the student enrollment details. Or there's a training, the SENR data population training. It's broken down into modules. It's at the CSIS YouTube training channel.